Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
This week, we're discussing Chapter 6 of Stephanie Kelton's Deficit Myth. And the title of the chapter is You're Entitled. This chapter is all about Social Security and other entitlement programs and what it means for them to be sustainable. Unsurprisingly, Kelton doesn't believe that Social Security is facing a crisis where it will run out of money soon or something like that. And I think we generally agree with that. So let's dive right in and get to the first quote from the chapter. Myth number 6. Entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare are financially unsustainable. We can't afford them anymore. Reality. As long as the federal government commits to making the payments, it can always afford to support these programs. What matters is our economy's long-run capacity to produce real goods and services people will need. So I think the first thing to note here is that in the myth, she's very careful to say financially unsustainable, right? There are ways in which you could have entitlement programs that are not sustainable, but she's adding the qualifier financially on there because of the government's ability to issue money to kind of pay for anything nominally, right? So that doesn't really speak to the sustainability of Social Security and other entitlement programs. It's more speaking to the fact that the government, if they wanted to, could print money, even if it would be really irresponsible to put too much of it out there or something like that. And then the term afford, I think, if you're thinking of afford in can we actually generate the dollars, can the government generate the dollars to meet its nominal commitments, then yeah, they always can, if you're assuming that they're not facing the constraints that governments actually do face on their spending, which is, there's the price stability constraint. You can't spend so much money that your currency isn't stable anymore, that kind of thing. So just, like once we kind of point all that stuff out, what she's saying is what she's saying that's a myth actually is a myth, because the government can throw as much money nominally out there as they want to if they're not following the rules of managing a currency correctly. Okay, so that's the sense in which it's a myth. Reality. So she's saying two things here. The first thing she's saying is that you can do it as long as the government commits to making the payments. And then the second thing she's saying is that what matters is our long-run capacity to produce real goods and services that the people will need once they're receiving the benefit payments. So then the question to ask is, well, which one is it, right? Is it that the government just has to commit to making the payments, or is it that we're constrained by the economy's productive capacity? And I think it's the second one. Right. It's not, and you'll see this kind of throughout this chapter. She kind of makes these points again and again and uses this kind of, I don't want to say this language that's maybe hard to parse to kind of get the correct understanding of. But it's not that Social Security is sustainable as long as the government commits to making the payments. It's that it's sustainable as long as we have the real resources. And she does get into this distinction later and is clearer about it in other parts. But right here, it's a little bit murky.
I mean, we've been over this a lot. I think that you and I basically agree with Stephanie Kelton here. When she adds the word financially, that sort of gets her off the hook, I think, from the trouble that you're pointing up.
Yeah.
But I guess you're just trying to make the point that what she's saying isn't that it's not that useful or helpful. Because sure, if you don't care about price stability and everything, then yeah, the government can always afford, quote unquote, to issue the money. I mean, is it really fair though for you to sort of not be emphasizing what she is emphasizing here, that there's a lot of government policymakers and politicians who are implying that there is this box of money filling up, and we need to add in a source into that box, and we need to be careful how much we take out. That does seem to be the operating logic of other people, so we can certainly understand her frustration with that, right? And you're just not sold on her choice of words, her vocabulary, and how she addresses this problem.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think if we're going to be charitable to her, I generally agree with what she's saying here. I think this language can be misleading, the language that she's using. On the one hand, it can make MMT believers feel like more is possible than actually is possible, and it can make MMT skeptics feel like she's not recognizing the actual constraints that are being faced. And the word financial, she is using it in this way to kind of get her off the hook. What she means is nominal constraints if the government's allowed to, spend as much as they want. To use the word financial for that, I think that's a little bit difficult for me. Like, I'm acknowledging that she's using it in that way, but the real resource constraints are, I would say, a kind of financial constraint, because you're constrained by the ability to get the goods to flow to the people, or the resources to flow where you want them to flow.
Yeah, I think a way of summing this up is just that, like, it's totally fine to debunk this idea that there's a box money that's to fill up, but we do have a problem when she makes statements like, the government can always make the payments, because that's just not saying that sentence. It doesn't really make sense. We can't always make the payments if we want to do the thing that she wants us to do, which is be concerned about the real resources, right? So there's some disconnect. There's some problem, I think, in the way that they're modeling the problem. That's evidenced in the phrasing here.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, there isn't this kind of box of money that you're talking about, but there's a box of something, right? So the kind of mental model that people have in their head that, oh, we're going to run out of something, or we need to get enough of something to do something, that part is correct. They're just thinking in nominal terms, which maybe doesn't map quite onto the resources the way that they think it does. So I think, people's intuitions about how this stuff works are kind of close to what the reality is, but they're maybe constraining themselves unnecessarily, which is what Stephanie Kelton would say too. But I guess I'm being more charitable to the people who want to balance the budget, or who are worried about running out of money, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and maybe that's what's really missing here is, because once you take this, what you could call an MMT-ish view, the real resources view, actually the concerns of a lot of, who Kelton calls the budget hawks and everything, like it makes sense. There is a limited amount of real resources, right? And we have to prioritize our spending. So when you take a lot of the concerns that people have that raise to this, concerns about inflation and concerns about the government spending too much money, it's very freeing, really, to just accept a lot of those, the premises behind those arguments, and just say, oh yeah, that makes total sense. You are right on that point. And then you can go into this. It's much easier from that point of agreement to explain, but the nominal totals, those aren't important, right? That's not what we need to look at. So exactly, I guess I wish I heard more of that from her in this chapter.
Yeah, me too. A lot of this chapter is just her telling anecdotes about people who are getting it wrong. So I skipped all those parts in the quotes. We won't be getting into any of that.
I do hope that we'll talk about the Alan Greenspan part, because I like that section.
We can talk about that. I don't think I actually quoted that.
Okay.
I think we actually talked about that Paul Ryan, Alan Greenspan interaction in a Boston Basic Income a long time ago, back when we were in person.
Surely, yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to the next quote. And I just said we weren't going to do the anecdotes, but this one actually is kind of one of them. So, okay. When Franklin D. Roosevelt established Social Security, he tried to protect it by setting up some special rules about how it would be paid for. That turned out to be a mistake. It put the political emphasis on the source of the program's finances, when what we should really be talking about is our values, our priorities, and our nation's real productive capacity. So the thing that struck me here is that we're always talking about our values and our priorities. It's not like we're thinking about, oh, we have a budget constraint, therefore we're not thinking about values and priorities. We're always thinking about values and priorities. And we have reasons why we want the government to do certain things. We might be confused about the constraints the government faces, but I think everyone understands that whatever our constraints may be, we want to do our best to promote our values and priorities.
Sure. I think that certainly there's notes that she hits here that implies that people don't all agree on what those values are, right? And so I think MMT would feel that there's a lot of people in governance who don't share, the same goals. So I think that does get a bit thorny when you try to figure out how do you attempt to reconcile apparently irreconcilable goals. But you tend not to delve into that arena too much.
Yeah, and maybe I would say that even if people disagree on priorities and disagree on values, they're all thinking in terms of that, and they're thinking about like, okay, how do I get what I think is important within the constraints that I think are constraining us, right?
Yeah. Let's see if this comes up again as we move further into it.
Okay, let's go to the next one here. Everyone deserves to know they'll have medical care when they need it, financial security when they become old or disabled, and assistance if they lose a job or fall on hard times. So the reason I chose this one is because the question is, what makes it so that people deserve the benefit, right? Is it because you lost a job or fell on hard times? And then another question is, does it have to be, do government benefits or do entitlement programs have to be about, helping people when they're down? Or can people just naturally, during the normal course of life, be entitled to something? And obviously this is a, basic income discussion, and basic income is not for people who have lost their job or have fallen on hard times. It's like the normal way you get your money, even when you're doing fine. That's just kind of like a normal part of how the system is functioning. So I just, I kind of wanted to call attention to that.
Yeah, to anyone listening who may be new to this show, I mean, I think I think to many people this sounds like a very innocuous statement. And of course, if people lose a job, fall on hard times, or are too old, we should help them, right? But I guess what you're trying to draw attention to is that when you phrase it that way, with the big if here, and you create that condition, you're sort of starting from the assumption that normally people shouldn't be supported and shouldn't have a regular income and shouldn't
Right.
Receive the full benefit of what the economy can produce for them. And that's kind of weird, right? I mean, everything else that we do really is, if we're whenever we contribute to society or do anything, hopefully the idea is that this benefits everyone, that we'll all benefit from a better system and a better economy. So it is yeah, it is strange. I think we need to start sort of examining why is it only in these particular circumstances, right, that we wouldn't want to maximize the benefit that people receive.
Exactly. Yeah. Generally speaking, we want the economy to promote the prosperity of everyone, right? And then we have these kind of safety net programs that are supposed to catch people when they fall, or like there's this separate thing where we have certain things that support people when the economy doesn't work or something like that. So when you talk about an entitlement program, you can ask, well, is this part of the normal functioning of how things are, or is it for helping people who get left behind by the system? Like, is it part of the system, or is it for people who get left behind by the system? And I think, we would argue that basic income is part of the system in the same way that universal health care or something might be part of the system. It's not just for, a measure that you take to help someone who's fallen on hard times. And I think there are reasonable things that you would want to do to give people extra support when they fall on hard times, and that's fine too. But she doesn't seem to be. I mean, even Social Security is actually kind of a thing that's normal for when people retire, but it still has this implication that you lived a life where you didn't need it for a while, and then you did because you're retiring, and you deserve it because you contributed. And it's actually set up that way, right? You get paid proportionally to how much you earned or how much you contributed, right?
It's interesting because the title of this chapter is "You're Entitled." And there are parts of it, I think, where she does sort of try to make this case that, like, look, we do want to normalize benefits, and we don't want to be using language that excludes people. But yeah, with paragraphs like this, it is by implication saying if you're reading this book and you are, currently working, or young, or not old enough, or not sick, right? then you're not really entitled to these benefits that she's talking about. You're entitled to them maybe in the future after you've put in your years of work and years of service, right? So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. There are parts of this chapter, though, I don't know if you pulled out any quotes, but there are parts of it where it's, she talks about the benefits of having a reliable income source and that sort of thing. So it's very close to then taking the next logical step and saying, well, okay, why should people ever be poor if they don't have to be? But she doesn't really fully get there. And I try to make that point because I do run into people who are readers of MMT. I got a message from someone the other day who was saying like, yeah, okay, I'm familiar with MMT and everything, but then they don't really talk about basic income that much. And for a lot of people, there isn't this strange disconnect. Like if they believe MMT, it's like, oh, well, and that's why we should have a basic income. And they're sort of confused why MMT doesn't support it. So I find that really interesting context for this chapter.
Yeah, I think if all you think is, or you kind of, your knowledge of MMT is that, oh, maybe the government doesn't have to balance its budget, then the question is, why can't you just do all the things you want to do? And there's answers for that. And there's answers for maybe why a basic income would be one of the things you would want to do. But that generally is not something that MMTers subscribe to. So let's go to the next one. MMT shows us why we don't have to pit one group against another in some desperate and unnecessary attempt to solve a financial crisis. It tells us why looking at the sustainability of entitlement programs in financial terms misses the point, and why the biggest challenges facing these programs have nothing to do with affordability. So yeah, I mean, I think this is another one of those paragraphs where we just generally agree with her. But then again, she uses the word affordability here, I guess kind of in a narrow sense, like affordability in nominal terms. Whereas, you could reasonably use the word affordability, even maybe more so than financial, to talk about real resources. Like, do we have the real resources to be able to afford to do X, right?
Yeah, I very much like before. We're just sort of nitpicking on this point, but for an important reason, because the question, "Can we afford Social Security?" is actually really important, and especially if once you take the view that these spending flows, these new flows of money, do come at the cost of other things we could be spending on. So you could say, for example, okay, so Social Security is a good idea, but then what if we what if you compare it to something like basic income? And then you sort of have to eventually face the fact that, well, at some level, there's a point where a higher Social Security would have to come at the cost of a lower basic income, or vice versa, right? So then we have to decide, okay, what's the best use of these resources? We have to start thinking like an economist about the issue. So yeah, when she just says we shouldn't be arguing about the affordability, that's, again, I know what she means, but that's not how we would ever phrase it. I think that kind of distracts.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, we are nitpicking a little bit, but I think that's partly because someone who's kind of reading this chapter casually or reading this book casually might get the wrong impression because of how she's using these words. So let's go to the next one. FDR defined his broader vision in terms of economic rights, including the right to what he called a useful and remunerative job, as well as the right to an adequate income, a decent home, adequate medical care, and protection from economic hardship caused by old age, unemployment, accident, or other misfortunes. So it's interesting here because there's an assumption. If you're going to promise that people have these rights, you're assuming that we have the resources to provide these things for people, right? If you're making the promise and you think you can live up to that promise, you feel you have an idea of that. Okay, we can do this. We can afford to do this in terms of resources. And then also here, people have the right to a useful and remunerative job. Now this kind of ties into the MMT job guarantee thing. But as soon as you're making something like that a right, it's kind of impossible for it to be useful, because if you're creating a job, I make this point all the time, but if you're creating a job for the benefit of the worker, you're doing it for a reason other than the product of the labor. So there's, if you want to keep all your jobs useful, then you don't necessarily want to promise everyone a job. And if you want to, keep all your jobs useful, you don't necessarily want to make any promises about how much they're going to pay either, because there's a lot of work that we do that's not paid, and that's fine. And the labor market is for when you want to get people to do something different. So I like that he has adequate income as the thing, but if you have adequate income and you have a right to that, and we're able to kind of sustain that, we have the resources to sustain some level of whatever is adequate, then you don't need to do it through the job. You don't need to do it through the labor market. So you don't need people to have jobs. You don't need those jobs to be any particular level of remunerativeness, right? And you can let the labor market do what it does.
This section calls attention to the fact that, our biggest disagreement with MMT is not with MMT specifically. It's with a much broader emphasis on, this idea of a right to a job and the right to be useful, which is, like you're saying, kind of weird. If, you can't make all jobs useful, and also distribute all jobs to as many people as possible. Those two things work against each other. So yeah, I think this is not at all unique to MMT. This sounds a lot like the Federal Reserve rhetoric when they talk about employment as a kind of a broad-based and inclusive goal that they're trying to distribute to everyone, to give to everyone. And at some point, we sort of just we have to examine, does that? I understand this is appealing to a lot of people. People like the idea that everyone can be useful, but if we were asking, what would we trade, right? The appearance of everyone being useful or actual more benefit to more people, right? Which would we actually accept the poorest person in society getting poorer just to put more people to work? And I don't think that really makes sense. But unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not sure how to describe it today. That's just, we can't even see that that's the trade-off we're making, because we're not really making that trade-off. We're operating underneath our capacity. So it's not obvious. It's not obvious to people that make work can make people poorer. It's actually the opposite seems to be true. Make work appears to be making people richer because it does. So I don't know. I'm not sure if do you think that, I guess the question for you, do you think we'll ever get to a point before we have like a full fiscal calibration, before we actually have to make that choice? Will it be obvious to people? Can you convince people that, actually you might be making people poorer, right? By creating this unnecessary work. Or do we have to sort of wait until after we have a basic income before that becomes clearer?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a chicken egg thing, right? How do you convince people to do the basic income if they're not convinced of this, right? If they're not convinced that they're poorer than they would be in a counterfactual world that had basic income, or a counterfactual world that didn't overemploy people or something like that. But yeah, this notion of full employment, it feels really good to economists because, hey, if you have full employment, everyone's getting their money, plus we're getting the most out of our labor, but we're not. We're maximizing the use of people's time, and that's not the same thing as maximizing the product of the economy. Bethany has a couple points in the chat. She says, Stephanie clearly views labor as a key limiting factor in productive capacity. I noticed that she also mentioned investing in automation when discussing the aging population. Yeah, so toward the end of the chapter, she gets into demographics and people getting older, and how are you going to sustain the level of economic output when more people are kind of moving out of the labor force. And if you're in a situation where you're actually starting in a position of getting the most out of your labor, and then you're losing some of that, that can be tricky. And you might want to be like, well, I hope automation can keep up with the rate at which people leave the labor force, or something like that. Or you might have to say like, oh, we have to keep people in the labor force longer before they can retire because there's so many people getting older at the same time. But then the third option, which I think is closer to reality, is that we are not employing people maximally productively. So the simplest adjustment we can make is to allow people to leave the labor force and then allow the remaining people to be more productive, because we're not kind of creating jobs for the purpose of employing people and providing them with income and stuff like that anymore. And Bethany has a separate point, which is that Kelton, or sorry, do you want to respond to that, Derek?
Well, I just want to say I also noticed that, and I thought it was interesting when she briefly interjected automation there, and it did make me wonder. And maybe, hopefully, we'll get to this. Hopefully, she talks about it more later in the book. But it did make me wonder about what is Kelton's and what is MMT in general's. Like, what is their definition of automation, and how do they talk about it? Does Stephanie think about automation in terms of, oh, this process which will eliminate the need for jobs, or just like something that makes the economy more efficient? And obviously, we can keep creating more jobs, right? Because it would be really interesting, I think, to ask a federal jobs guarantee proponent the question of, okay, well, if automation got advanced enough to remove our actual need for jobs, what is the job guarantee doing then? Is it a good outcome to just keep creating? That just gives us more room to create more not technically necessary jobs for people, or would some of them say, well, that's just not the world we live in, right?
They often punt on this question when you're talking to an MMTer. They're often punt on this question when you're talking to an MMTer. They're sometimes not willing to go to the thought experiment of, okay, what if our economy is at its max and kind of reaching its capacity, and then what are the trade-offs? What if we can use labor a lot more efficiently and don't need people to work as much? They'll kind of go back and say, like, well, no, the reality we're living in is that we're not close to that. So maybe Kelton is broaching this a little bit there. And I'd be curious about that too. My sense is that there's this ingrained belief that even though they talk about the job guarantee as the jobs being productive, there's this just assumption that people are better off if they're not retired. They're better off having jobs. So you'd still want a job guarantee, even if automation is making the jobs less necessary, because you could still find something useful for people to do, even if it's not as important as maybe some of the stuff that the automation is doing, that kind of thing. My sense is that you're not going to nudge them off the job guarantee, and you're not going to nudge them toward a basic income, even in this hypothetical thought experiment of our economy being at that point. And I think that's partly because they don't think about, or they don't really explicitly talk about, at least, kind of the labor leisure trade-off, that anytime you're employing people, that's a cost. They're thinking of it as a benefit. Like, people are better off if they have jobs and they're contributing to the economy. And the fact that they're contributing to the economy is part of what makes them better off. And the fact that you're employing people in the job guarantee is, and the fact that they're being productive is part of what makes it so you can afford it, right? They're producing stuff, so the money you give them can go towards production. Whereas with a basic income, it feels like, oh no, you're giving people free money, but you're not simultaneously activating any production on the other side. Now, of course, you and I realize that the same is true in a job guarantee. You're not necessarily activating very much production on the other side. You're using the job as an excuse to give people money so they can go out and spend it. So we wouldn't see that as a tension so much, but MMT does, and they're very skeptical of basic income for that reason. Yeah. Bethany has a couple more points. So Kelton makes some points often used to support basic income when discussing why Social Security should go to everyone. And I think its universality and therefore popularity impacts why she focuses so much on it in this chapter. Yeah, I think that's true. I think politically speaking, a universal program is going to be more appealing if it's something that everybody gets. If it's something that you get and you understand, then it's something that if it gets taken away, it gets taken away from you. If it's something that only goes to some people, then well, that's those people. That's not me, right? So that's an important political kind of point there.
Yeah, the section where she talks about Social Security sounds almost exactly like some of the debates I've gotten into about basic income. What she says, why should the government pay Social Security to people like Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey? These folks are set for life. And so it's very much the kind of thing you hear about basic income. Why should rich people get it, right? And then her answers are actually kind of similar about how means testing can undermine the universal support, and also that it. But she also says that it sort of um, it's not solving the right problem. It's sort of assuming that the dollars are limited again, right? When in reality, what allows us to give everybody more dollars is that there's more goods, right? So when you're not giving the dollars to Bill Gates or Oprah, then that doesn't help us pay out more Social Security. This is almost exactly the kind of stuff we might talk about with basic income. And I think Kelton's way of describing these things maybe is why so many people don't seem to see a conflict between MMT and basic income the way that MMT authors do.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. So let's go on to the next one. And this one is actually one that that I basically have no objection to. She says, it's always important to think about whether our economy has the productive capacity to deliver the real benefits, such as doctors, nurses, hospital beds, needed to adequately handle the demand created by government programs. Yes, exactly. You need that. You need that with basic income too. I mean, I think there's this sense in MMT that basic income is this reckless thing because it gives people the money without also creating the resources. But it's important to understand that consumers need a source of money regardless. And if it's not coming from basic income, it's going to be coming from some other source that's maybe less efficient, like an overstimulated financial sector or jobs that actually aren't productive, that kind of thing. And it's not the case that the productive capacity of the economy needs to be directly tied to the income that people are getting from the government. And that's kind of the important distinction there.
Yeah, that's right. And she's exactly right here.
Yeah. So let me bring up the next one. Entitlement programs also come under attack because of something called the dependency ratio, which compares the number of people currently working with the number of people receiving benefits. For Medicare and Social Security, the concern is expressed in terms of the age dependency ratio. So this is like, lumping people into two categories. Either you're a maker or a taker. You're either contributing as a worker, or you've reached the phase of your life where now you're taking something back. And something I would highlight here is that it's good that they're thinking in real terms. In terms of, it's not about necessarily the money. It's about, okay, the workers are contributing to real production, and then the dependents are, using up real resources or real output or something like that. So that's important, right? It's analogous to thinking in money terms, but it's thinking in terms of real resources, and that feels right. There's a problem here, though, and it's not the problem that Kelton points out. It's that to a large extent, workers are also dependents. And this has to do with labor policy and economic policy designed to boost employment, create jobs, that kind of thing. And just kind of to reiterate what I was saying before, to the extent that we employ people unproductively as an excuse to pay them or provide them other benefits, those people are taking more than they're giving. So I don't think you can divide people into makers and takers just by whether they happen to be employed or not. There are a lot of employed people who maybe feel like makers and look like makers to society and are considered makers in some economic theories and economic models, but they're really using up more resources than they're contributing.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I guess I'd also like to add that because later in the chapter she does say that, goes on to say that the dependency ratio is sort of nevertheless important, despite the concern over that is important. And I'm not really, obviously not everyone in society can consume more than they produce, but I'm not sure like the ratio of how, even if you solve this worker problem you mentioned and you actually did have sort of a model that said, okay, here's the consumers and then here's the people that are productive. I don't know if like the ratio of consumers to producers of when you look at the whole population, like would that really tell you that much? Because I could sort of imagine like the population growing and you have a certain number of really, really hyperproductive people, and technology allows, a smaller number of people to get more and more productive. Would you learn anything by deciding, oh, the ratio is 20% or 30 or 70%? Would that expect to tell you anything about the economy's real productive capacity to benefit consumers?
So I think in the general sense, no, but maybe in the specific sense, in the specific case of retirement benefits, if you have the assumption that, well, everybody's going to work and everybody's going to retire later, and then among the people who are working, there's, you know, some kind of normal distribution of productivity, and then that distribution stays the same when they all retire. If that's what you're looking at, if you're looking at, you know, people who are still in the working phase versus the retirement phase, then you can kind of aggregate it, and you'd get the same. You'd get kind of an expected shift in productive capacity or something like that.
But if you stop sort of caring about where you draw the line between who's retired, who's not, and who's a worker and who's not, then none of that really applies.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think you'd really want to figure all this stuff out by counting the number of workers and counting the number of people who aren't in the labor force and that kind of thing. What you really want to look at is, what can our economy handle? What is our economy handling in terms of output and spending, and what are the limits of that? And just kind of feeling that out empirically, rather than trying to model it based on some estimates of who's a worker and who's productive and who's a dependent or that kind of thing.
And that's a problem, because that's exactly what we're doing today. If you make full employment the goal, and high employment is better, just a higher percentage of the population is working, if you're assuming that that's leading to more production, that's a serious problem.
Yeah, that's right. I always like to draw the distinction between input capacity and output capacity. So input capacity means, are you using up all of the resources that I gave you? And then output capacity is, are you getting the most out of the resources that are available to you? And those are two very different things. So when Kelton talks about, or when any economist talks about full employment being equivalent to the economy being at full capacity, they're drawing an equivalence between input capacity and output capacity. So let's go to the next one. So this is after she talks about a guy who has hands that are weak, and he had a hard life as a worker, that kind of thing. So she says, that man and other workers like him don't deserve to be insulted for wanting to retire and collect benefits after a lifetime of hard and painful work. So now she's bringing in this language of, people deserve the entitlement. It's not like you're entitled because everyone's entitled. It's like you're entitled because you had, this difficult life and you actually like did your part, that kind of thing. So it's getting back into this kind of value of work and valuing people based on their labor, that kind of thing. So the question is, why judge what people deserve based on how hard they worked and how painful it was? And there's an answer to that. You would want to do that if that creates an incentive for people to do the work, and you need people to do the work. But maybe that's not really the place. Does the government really need to be doing that? Does it need to be creating work incentives for people? Obviously, if his hands hurt, I want to help him regardless of whether that came from, a lifetime of painful labor, or, he was just, walking along and slipped on a banana peel and broke his hands, right? Like he's someone whose hands are hurting.
Yeah, and I agree with all that, but this is really tricky, right? I mean, I think it seems that people have really strong intuitions about moments that should cause us to want to help people, and this is one of them. If you see some who's he's worked so hard and he's in pain, we have to help him. Yeah, when you think about how we actually efficiently go about providing medical services to people in general, there isn't really a point where it would make sense for someone to fill out the questionnaire and explain to the doctor why the hands hurt. That might be helpful in diagnosing the problem, but it's not helpful about whether or not he should deserve the care. So when you're making this positive moral argument about why people deserve it, like there is this other side of it, which is there's an implied negative argument about why other people don't deserve it. And this kind of conflicts with Kelton's other rhetoric about how really what should determine what we deserve is the economy's potential, the economy's real potential. There's a conflict there that's not being examined. And I guess it's just because these are These are really powerful, though, right? These moral arguments, and they're very common, and it's very easy to fall back on those when making statements like this.
Yeah, and these moral arguments, they exist to create an incentive. The reason why you're going to say some people deserve something and other people don't is because you want to create an incentive for that behavior, for the behavior that you've defined to be deserving. I mean, it might not be a conscious thing, but in terms of culturally, that evolved as an incentive. Like you get rewarded for your contribution. Now, so when we're thinking about, okay, are we providing benefits only to certain people for certain reasons? We need to be conscientious of that. Are we doing this because we actually need this incentive here? Or are we doing this because we've got kind of some leftover moral intuition or something like that? Or are we just using rhetoric to, activate people's moral intuitions to convince them of something else, which is maybe what Kelton is doing here.
That might be it, yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to the next one. The most important thing to remember is that there are 3 distinct issues, and we must keep them separate whenever we talk about programs like Social Security and Medicare. Those issues are 1, the government's financial ability to pay, 2, the legal authority to pay benefits, and 3, our economy's productive capacity to deliver real program benefits. So 1, again, is she's talking about nominal constraints that don't exist if you are a monetarily sovereign nation. So you can issue as much of your own money as you want. Technically, any country could do this. They could say, okay, this is a token that I'm issuing, and I want you to use it as money, and maybe I'll put some measures in place to backstop its purchasing power or something like that. But you're not going to get very far with that if you're a small developing country, because people aren't just automatically going to keep valuing your currency if they don't have some kind of enforceable promise that it can be converted into goods, that it can be traded for goods. So anyway, I kind of went off on a tangent on that one, but this first one is really about, there is no nominal constraint. And then the second one is about, so legal authority, that's talking about, are you imposing restrictions on yourself that are unnecessary? Are you the government saying, okay, we're not allowed to do this, or we're not allowed to spend more on Social Security, we're not allowed to blah 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 blah? Like, what's the legal framework that you've structured around whatever you're trying to do, and then how do you break free of that? And then the third one is the one that I think we all agree is the most important, which is once you understand the resource constraints or the productive capacity constraints, how do you make sure that you're not unnecessarily constraining yourself legally or imagining a nominal constraint that isn't real or something like that?
Is there any way in which we could agree that 1 and 3 are actually conceptually separate in any meaningful way? The government's financial ability to pay and the economy's capacity to deliver real benefits. Like, is there ever a scenario where it makes sense to sort of wonder about just, the government's ability to find or pay the money versus the goods that can be bought with that money?
Yeah. So to kind of generalize between these two things, the question is, can the government force a flow of goods and services toward the holders of the money that it spends? And for smaller countries that have smaller economies that are very dependent on international trade, developing economies that aren't, what MMT would call monetarily sovereign, that starts to look more like number 1. And then for the United States, it starts to look more like number 3, but it's fundamentally the same kind of thing. It's like, can people claim goods and products and services with their money, right?
Yeah, it's just interesting then, because Kelton, at least in this paragraph, seems to suggest that it is important to separate those two things.
Yeah. And I think in some level it is useful to separate those two things, especially when you're in the United States and you think you're constrained by the first thing, but it really looks more like the third thing, even though it's kind of a continuum, right? It's a continuum of how like even in the United States, if you are removing excess money from the economy, that might reduce the amount of spending that would otherwise happen and then free up fiscal capacity for you to spend more. But it's not one-to-one. It's not even close to being one-to-one. And depending on how you do it, it could be go in the other direction or something like that. Whereas if you have this, other smaller unit, like an individual city or something like that, then yeah, it's very close to being one-to-one, and they can still kind of issue new money by borrowing, but it looks more like, okay, they are borrowing because they have to get the money from somewhere, that kind of thing. It's mechanically the same thing as the United States government borrowing, but it's you're doing it to force a money flow towards yourself instead of doing it to force the flow of goods to continue to match the flow of spending in the economy or something like that. Yeah. But it's all on a continuum. It's all kind of like, I'd like to have a framework that makes it very easy to communicate that this is all the same kind of thing without people getting confused and thinking that a government like the United States is constrained in ways that they're not actually constrained. So I don't know if we'll maybe we can think about how to do that, but I think it would involve kind of shifting people's intuitions about how this stuff works, and maybe understanding money better, something like that. Let me bring up the next one here. So this is kind of a good follow-up to that. For countries like the US, the UK, and Japan, the government's financial ability to pay can never be in doubt. So again, it's all on this continuum. So the ability to pay, the ability to have the resources go towards, have the money be able to claim the resources, that always can be in doubt. You can be in doubt. If she says pay in kind of a narrow sense of like nominal terms, yeah, they can always meet their nominal commitments, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can just pay for anything, which is, if you look at the sentence just by itself, out of context, that's what it looks like it's saying. It looks like, oh, the United States can pay for whatever they want and buy whatever they want, right? But there are real constraints on the real spending capacity of these countries.
To play devil's advocate, then, what language would you use to describe the difference between, say, a local government and the federal government, which I think maybe is what, there are institutions, right, that where the financial ability to pay is sort of more constraining. So how would you describe that difference if it exists, if you believe it exists?
Yeah, I would say I would probably describe it by saying the ability to pay and the constraint on paying and what it looks like to run out of money look different in a country that kind of issues of a free-floating currency that's at the top of a very powerful economy, that kind of thing. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't use the language that the financial ability to pay can never be in doubt. I would say that the constraints on the government's ability to pay for things look a little bit different when everybody's using your liabilities as money, and you have to, as kind of like the base money of their economy, and then your mission is to ensure that people can claim a stable amount of goods and services with that money. Because if you're just an individual city, what you're spending into the economy is not your own liabilities. It's somebody else's liabilities. It's the liabilities of the government above you. So you are still able to issue debt and kind of create money in that way, but then that debt has to be swapped for the thing that you're actually going to spend. So you get to a point where you're actually spending your own liabilities into the economy as the money. So that, yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Obviously, I didn't answer it concisely and clearly with a snappy, pithy alternative. I guess I would question whether this is necessarily a point that needs to be made in this way. I'd probably say something like the United States, UK, and Japan are more flexible in terms of their spending, and it's not as much about balancing their budget, about balancing cash inflows and cash outflows. It's about balancing goods flows, because really the money that they're spending is not an IOU for a higher form of money; it's an IOU for goods.
As an attempt to provide a pithy summary, is one way of summing that up to say that both the federal and a local government their spending is constrained by their credit, and it's just that if you are issuing a currency that everyone is, a liability that everyone is using as currency, then you have a lot more credit than pretty much any other actor in the economy.
Yeah, that might, well, I guess let's try this on for size. If you are a city, then you are, your spending is constrained by the money that's being used in the greater economy. And if you're if you're the federal government of the United States, your spending is constrained by the goods. Like a city is spending IOUs for, when they create money, they're spending IOUs for the government's money, the federal government's money. And then when the government spends, they're spending IOUs for goods. So they're kind of operating at different levels of the hierarchy, of the money and credit hierarchy.
Yeah, I get you. That's something we'll have to think more about, because I think Bethany has raised earlier that, like, this is an important distinction that people are confused about, right? And so I think we can have a little bit of empathy for Kelton's, trying to sort it out.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. Yeah, I think what I would want to emphasize is that there's something very much analogous to the constraints that face monetarily sovereign countries and non-monetarily sovereign governments.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go to the next one. Oops. Funding ever more generous entitlement programs could push the economy beyond its real resource constraint, i.e. full employment, fueling inflation, which is harmful to all. This is a critical part of the messaging that is almost completely absent from our contemporary debates. So I guess my question is this absent? I think people often associate government deficits with, oh no, it's going to cause inflation. That's kind of like a common thing. And then just to emphasize again, the real resource constraint is not exactly the same thing as full employment. Since she's saying real resource constraint, she can maybe get away with it because maybe real resources are inputs and labor is an input. But then that's, you're not talking about full output or maxing out the economy's productive potential at that point. And I would say that additionally, just to nitpick a little bit more, it's not that inflation is a problem that it might cause and that we might need to worry about. It's that when you try to squeeze capacity from a place that has no capacity, the price level will adjust instead. Inflation occurs instead of the real government purchases.
I was going to say exactly the same thing, that it's, this is not a completely absent that concern at all. It's very common. And I mean, every debate I've ever had about this sort of thing, people, that's exactly what you hear. They may mention that, oh yeah, well, the government can't just print money, but then the reason why they make that assertion is because they believe that it's going to cause inflation. So a lot of people understand that. A lot of the critics understand that. So yeah. What was I going to say? I'm blanking out. Come back to me. There's something important I wanted to follow up with there.
Okay. In that case, I will move on to the next one. Yeah. That's too small. Here we go.
Oh, just really briefly, I remembered. So,
Yeah.
so I guess I would just say like a lot of, I think maybe this is why MMT and Kelton has to lean so heavily on repeating these statements about like how, the government is not constrained in how many dollars it can print and the government can always make its payments because, they don't have really a concise answer to why that idea is wrong, that printing more money will just cause inflation. So if they could just say, well, quantity theory of money is wrong, and here's this other theory of inflation that makes this make more sense, right? This is actually what's going on. Maybe they wouldn't have to do that. They wouldn't have to say, just be sort of repeating these negative statements. They would have a good positive statement to talk to instead. But when it comes to specifically the question of inflation, Kelton does talk about real resources and capacity, but there's not really, I haven't yet encountered in the book, like a really clear statement about, okay, well, this is what inflation is. This is why it's a problem. And this is, how that works. I didn't get that so far.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important point. Yeah, if they can get around making all these negative statements and because people's intuitions are pretty close to being right, that there are these constraints. You can't, there's not really an infinite free lunch or something like that. And MMT acknowledges that, but they spend so much time talking about the constraints that aren't there that it can start to feel like they don't believe in the constraints. So Eddie has a couple comments in the chat. He says, full employment is not the relevant real resource constraint. Productive capital is a more relevant resource constraint. Well, I guess the question is relevant to what? So I notice you say productive capital, so you're not assuming that the capital is unproductive. But you could, in terms of resources, they could be put towards production now, or they could be put toward capital, which can lead to higher productive capacity later. So there are constraints on what the economy can produce today, and then there are constraints on how much the economy can grow. And sometimes there's trade-offs, right? Like maybe I want to produce less today in order to invest more in economic growth for the future, and I'm going to put more resources toward that. I don't know that one of these constraints is more relevant than the other. What I would say is that what's important isn't that you put all these resources into capital or all these resources into production. What's important is that you did it efficiently. What's important is that you're maximizing the productivity of the capital you get out of this resource investment. You're maximizing the production you get out of this resource usage. So it's about the output rather than just using up all your inputs. I think that's the important distinction. So let's share the next one. Greenspan was concerned about the demographic changes that are leaving the US with a smaller number of workers to produce our national output. The dependency ratio is a legitimate concern here, not because there won't be enough money, but because we might struggle to make enough of the real goods and services that people will want and need in the coming years. Greenspan understood that it's not enough to pay monetary benefits to future retirees. The value of that money matters too. To guard against the age-old inflation problem of too much money chasing too few goods, we need an economy that's productive enough to supply the mix of goods and services that we'll need. So I think this is exactly right. I don't have any objections to this. I think Greenspan is exactly right, and I agree with Kelton's quoting of him. So we're getting towards the end. I'll just do one more. Oops. Okay, this is a short one. When we look to the future and think about how best to meet our needs, we should stop asking the question, how will we pay for it, and start asking, how will we resource it? So I think that's a weird, using resource as a verb like that, that's a weird phrasing. How will we pay for it, I think, is a fine question to ask. I think the answer is just, you've got to pay for it using resources, right?
And I guess it's worth noting, right, that it really isn't just a question of just how do you resource it, because we don't live in a barter economy where resources are going in one direction and resources are going in the other opposite direction all the time. That's very rare, in fact. But all of the time, every single transaction, whether the government's doing it, people are doing it, businesses, consumers, you typically have resources going in one direction and money going in the other. So how to pay for it, how the money works, that's super important. And a lot of times when we when we think about how to really efficiently optimize the economy's distribution, it really isn't sort of a question of, like, obviously you have to keep the resources in mind, but I'm also, what that looks like at the macro level is thinking about, what's the best way to put money into the economy, right? Where's the money going in the economy, and how do we maximize the amount of money people are spending, right? So you don't, one danger of the rhetoric here is that you slip into the money as a veil view and just say, oh, what matters is the goods and that's it. And we don't need to be concerned about the money that much, because that's not true. We do have to really be concerned with money. Money is super important.
Yeah, money is super important. And I think it's possible to pay attention to money, to not just look at it as a veil, while at the same time acknowledging that its role is to support the allocation of resources. So you can at the same time say that resources are what ultimately matter, and also say, and we're going to pay attention to money because money interacts with that in important ways that we need to pay attention to. So I think this is a good discussion. The summary of this chapter for me would be Social Security is not, facing a crisis, and these entitlement programs are not facing a crisis unless we want to politically do something to cause a crisis. I think we agree with Kelton on that, but maybe some of the way she's communicating it, we're not as on board with.
And I agree with that. And can I also just say that while we would definitely agree with her assertion that Social Security is not in crisis, something we might disagree with or question would be the assumption that, questioning the assumptions that Social Security is obviously the best way to do things, right? I mean, we can ask, if we had a really generous basic income, if we had achieved that, would you need to solve Social Security? In other words, what core problem does Social Security solve? Is it a way of getting people incomes? And if so, how does it compare to a basic income, right? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the two policies? And when you think about basic income, really the only difference between that and Social Security is that Social Security goes to fewer people, right? Less of the time, fewer people, less of the time. So then, does that make sense? Is that an important thing to have? And I'm not 100% sold that it is.
Well, if your goal is to give everyone money, then that is the key difference with Social Security and basic income. If your goal is to smooth out people's incomes when they retire, so to prevent people who aren't poor from becoming poor when they're not in the labor force anymore, then that's kind of the problem that Social Security solves, because it pays you money based on how much you put in. And it's kind of predicated on this assumption that everybody is working and contributing, or to the extent that they are, they get rewarded, and some of that reward comes after they retire. So it's kind of trying to solve a different problem than basic income. If you evaluate it based on the problem that basic income solves, it looks not as good. And I think the problem that basic income solves is a more important problem. I don't really care that much about workers in general, except to the extent that we need to provide them an incentive to work. I care about all people, and basic income solves a problem for all people and for the economy as a whole. So great discussion. Next week, we're getting into chapter 7, and that's the deficits that do matter. So looking forward to that with everybody.